In two previous videos, I talked about how I designed an airplane to counter a threat that never really existed, the Soviet Ekranoplan. And that got me doing a much deeper dive into the Ekranoplan and efforts that perhaps I had not planned on. Living in the US, information on classified Soviet era projects is scarce. It's almost as if not only are we former enemies, but things aren't going so great between Russia and Western powers right now. So, what I have been able to glean comes from only a few videos on the subject and a Russian state documentary that was translated into English. So, the information presented here may not be entirely accurate, but I'll do the best that I can. Now, one of my special interests is weird stuff in aviation and military history, and the weirder the better. And I especially like to play around with these concepts and work them around in my head to understand why they were ultimately a bad idea or not employed. There are a few factors, such as obsolescence after a long gestational period, economic factors, technological limitations of the time, etc., etc. However, in some cases, the general idea just isn't practical. And this is where I like to have a sandbox to play in. Fortunately, I can use programs like Flyout to construct them digitally, play around with them, and see how they would perform. And that's what we're going to do today, focusing in on the 20th century efforts of the Soviet Union to build, develop, and fly Ekranoplans. So first, let's talk about what an Ekranoplan is and how that's going to work. After that, we're going to talk through a brief history of why the Soviet Union was interested in it, then going through some operational considerations of the vehicle, and finally, explore a notional employment in a wartime setting before giving some basic conclusions. And so, with a lot of information to cover, let's get into it. Part 1. What is an Ekranoplan and what is ground effect? So, for starters, the Ekranoplan is a ground effect vehicle, which means that it's neither a boat nor an airplane. The distinction is nuanced but fairly simple. An airplane can accelerate and climb above the ground effect, and a ground effect vehicle cannot. So, what is ground effect? Well, it's a phenomenon near the ground that causes an airplane to float. What happens is that as the airplane gets closer to the ground, the air cannot get out of the way fast enough due to obstructions with the surface of the earth, and so it creates a cushion of air beneath the wings and temporarily increases performance. This increase in performance can be as much as 50% reduction in drag, with an increase in lift-over drag ratios by up to 30% and as little as 20%. Generally, it's said that ground effect starts within a wingspan of the ground, so an airplane with a 30-foot wingspan would start to experience ground effect 30 feet above the ground. New pilots learning how to land for the first time learn how to anticipate and use ground effect to their advantage to soften their landings. It's also used to practice soft field techniques by getting the airplane airborne early, remaining in the ground effect to accelerate, and then finally taking it into the skies. Large airplanes too need to be careful of ground effect, since they can get caught in it flying before they are generating enough lift to climb beyond it. Now, this is handled through the use of a calculated rotation speed based on weight and atmospherics for the day. But the ground effect vehicle takes advantage of this and uses that cushion. Since it reduces drag and increases the L over D ratio, it can carry more than an equivalent sized aircraft and use less fuel to do so. This obviously provides numerous advantages for things like cargo, but it can also be useful as a weapons platform. Part 2. The Strategic Situation, Soviet Doctrine, and Ekranoplan Origins. Before we talk about the Ekranoplan specifically, I want to zoom out and talk about the why behind its development as more than just a mere technological exercise. Weapons are never built in a vacuum. They have some geopolitical reasons to exist beyond simple curiosity. Now, I think it's fair to say that 1945 was a major turning point in history, and not just because it marked the end of the Second World War. It also saw the beginning of the end of the British Empire and the rise of the United States to effectively take its place as the global hegemon. Prior to 1945, Britannia ruled the waves, and after, very much Uncle Sam. What this meant was that the US specifically had a navy and a military that was able to practice force projection. Now, this was a natural result of fighting in two theaters of war on opposite sides of the globe. In stark contrast, the Soviet Union, who had lost a disproportionate number of people and equipment comparatively, was left with a military that was really good at marching across Europe towards Berlin. And a study of its history over the last century or so showed that the Western powers really liked to invade them through Poland. So inherently, a doctrinal dissonance started to form where the Soviets became afraid that its former allies, capable of force projection, could easily best their military in a march across Eastern Europe. So zooming out and looking at it macrocosmically, the Soviets decided that they first needed to be able to defend their motherland. Having witnessed the awesome power of US and British strategic bombing campaigns, they started by focusing on air defense, developing the SA-1 and SA-2 and subsequent missiles. Now the SA-2 would score his first kill by shooting down the U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers. But on the naval front, the Soviet Navy remained consistent with this bastion defense doctrine. Ships were designed to be able to defend the motherland as its primary mission. However, the Soviets had a restriction that the US and Britain did not. You see, throughout its history, Russia has always wanted a warm water port, and was able to get them through the conquest of land that became St. Petersburg during the 1700s, and then Sevastopol in modern Ukraine from the Ottoman Turks during the reign of Tsarina Catherine the Great. However, both of these options present problems. In the case of St. Petersburg, it opens up into the Baltic Sea and needs to pass through Denmark in order to gain access to the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. A 1960s article in the Naval Institute's magazine Proceedings describes control of the Danish Straits as a key part of a future war with the Soviets. Denmark, it's worth noting, was one of the original signatories of NATO in 1949. Thus, the Soviet Navy was likely to be bottled up in the Baltic Sea unless it could find a way to bust out. As a note, the Øresund on the other side of Copenhagen straddles Denmark and Sweden. While Sweden was not in NATO during the Cold War and it attempted to be neutral, it definitely favored NATO over the Warsaw Pact and would likely have refused to allow Soviet and Warsaw Pact vessels through these straits as well. Sevastopol isn't much better. It's located on the Crimean Peninsula and has unrestricted access to the Black Sea. However, the Black Sea only has access to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, two waterways that are controlled by Turkey, who is also a NATO member joining in 1952. However, unlike the Danish Straits, naval transit through the Dardanelles and Bosphorus are governed by an international treaty called the Montreux Convention. In short, in peacetime, Turkey allows the transit of warships with 8 days' notice for the Black Sea powers, of which the Soviet Union was one. However, these warships must meet certain requirements for tonnage and fleet limitations that are beyond the scope of this video, except that they place limits on how large and what kind of vessels the Soviets could build, and that only further reinforce the naval doctrines of bastion defense. The Soviets never did build a proper aircraft carrier. The Kiev classes were designed to be compliant with the Montreux Convention after all, and the Slava-class anti-aircraft ships ultimately became the prize of the fleet as opposed to the nuclear aircraft carriers of the American Navy. Therefore, looking at it from a strictly Soviet perspective, its only European theater warm water ports were effectively blocked by its chief adversary, NATO. It's easy to see how they could have felt surrounded. And on top of all of those restrictions, there's another strategic consideration here as well. In order to have any chance of winning in a naval battle in the North, Baltic, Mediterranean, or Black Seas, the Soviets were going to need to take out American carriers. Combined arms doctrine tells us that you don't fight fire with fire. Rather, you need to find a solution that maneuvers around the strengths of your adversary's weapon and exploits its weakness. For a land-based analogy, you don't fight tanks with other tanks. You use a frickin' A-10 Warthog. The same can be said on how to take on an American supercarrier. Now, over time, the Soviets spent money on multiple technologies, ultimately settling on submarines and sea-based cruise missiles that were specifically designed to counter the aircraft carrier. But it was a long journey that took a circuitous route through technological advancements and dead ends alike to finally get there. Now, as a quick addendum, this is one of the reasons why carriers travel in strike groups, with Aegis-equipped picket ships and point defense systems. It seems the games of one-upsmanship never truly end. So this is where the Ekranoplan enters the picture. It's the late 1950s, early 1960s, and the Cold War is hotting up. This is before the Cuban Missile Crisis and even before the Bay of Pigs. Khrushchev is in power, and from his perspective, his air defenses just shot down an American spy plane over his own territory. His access to the open sea is compromised with NATO blocking all major waterways into the Atlantic Ocean, except for Murmansk, which is frozen over half the year anyway. And he needs to find a way to be able to neutralize the carrier threat and gain access to the Atlantic in the event a conventional shooting war on the European continent happens. Enter Rostistov Alexiev, an engineering visionary that had considered a new type of transport, the Ekranoplan. He had visions for it to be used for civil purposes, but pitched it for military use in order to get money from the state government. Khrushchev was intrigued since it presented a chance to have a carrier killer and to also leapfrog the Americans technologically. And so funding was put in place in 1962, just before the Cuban Missile Crisis that would happen in October of that year. Eventually, three major types of Ekranoplans were built: the KM, the Orleanak, and the Loon. The KM, or Caspian Sea Monster, was the biggest, but was also a proof of concept. The Orleanak was intended for troop transport during amphibious operations, and it would prove to be the most successful, with at least 3 being produced and commissioned as vessels in the Soviet and later Russian navies. The final iteration, the Loon, was an anti-surface weapon system entering service in 1987, 7 years after the death of Alexiev. KM, the Caspian Sea Monster herself, was the most famous, however. In service as a test bed from 1966 to about 1980, it conducted multiple flight tests that were considered promising, revising and refining the technology that would pave the way for the Orleanak class. Unfortunately, the vessel would crash in 1980 on a routine test flight and sink. Apparently, it was deemed to be such a low priority that the wreckage floated for 3 days with no attempt to recover it. Overall, while Khrushchev was enthusiastic, he was effectively forced out after the Cuban Missile Crisis and their Ekranoplans champion was gone. Leonid Brezhnev, who succeeded Khrushchev, was a much more capital C conservative and preferred traditional surface ships to technological gambles. Ekranoplans continued with 4 Orleanoks being built, tested, flown, and used as troop transports. Despite these being the most successful of their Ekranoplans, records about their service histories are largely unknown beyond this. Which brings us to the Loon, which is probably the best and ultimate expression of the combat Ekranoplan. Designed by Alexeyev in 1975, built in the 80s, and commissioned in the Caspian Flotilla in 1987, it was designed specifically to take on surface ships and the American carrier. But like the remaining Orleanoks, it was decommissioned on or about 1993. Part 3. Operational Considerations. So, for those of you who are here for more Flyout content, this is the section that you want to pay attention to. Since I will never get into a Loon class and operate it, most likely, I don't have the ability to play with this technology except through a digital sandbox games like Flyout. So, for this video, I built a reasonably accurate model of a Loon class Ekranoplan. However, it's missing the anti-ship missile since this isn't supported in the game. But I did fly it over the water like it would have been employed in the real world. So let's start with the advantages that this system would offer a potential military. First, since most radars, and especially those of the time, were straight line distance, the Ekranoplan can remain below the radar for an extended period of time. Second, unlike a surface ship, it flies above the water, meaning sonar systems are useless as well. It also has the advantage of speed. The Loon was supposed to be able to cruise at 250 knots, which is the same speed for an aircraft limit below 10,000 feet in the US, and the Loon had a maximum speed of 300 knots. Now, this is comparable to a light business jet in terms of speeds that close to the water. Third, as we've already stated, it has a massive relative payload capacity, which enables it to carry large weapons, larger than comparable aircraft, or cargo or personnel in the case of an amphibious invasion. Now, these advantages inevitably lead to thoughts as to how this sort of technology can be employed as a vehicle of war. Immediately, 3 options come to mind. The first is a fast attack strike on surface ships and probably aircraft carriers. A second is for fast transport of men and supplies to support amphibious operations. And a third is for anti-submarine patrols. At some point, all 3 of these were tried by the Soviet Union. However, operating at these speeds within a wingspan of the surface of the water doesn't exactly come without its share of challenges. For one, maintaining that altitude and speed is incredibly exhausting on pilots flying their Ekranoplan. The Loon class that I replicated here has a wingspan of 44 meters or just over 144 feet, which means that at best, its maximum height that they can get above the surface is 144 feet. The advertised maximum height, according to Wikipedia, was only 5 meters or 16 feet, only a tenth of the wingspan. The model that I built for Flyout is a close approximation of the Loon class. Its engines are ramped up a little bit, but the aerodynamics are meant to be the same. I could take the aircraft up above a full wingspan, but had issues keeping it at a good ground effect level. Now, this leads me to believe that the ground effect may not be fully modeled in the game. No matter, I was able to get a good approximation of altitude and speed, enough for me to make some general conclusions. Having done some low-level flying at those speeds in real life, we teach that crews need to maintain a constant 30 seconds to live in terms of aircraft maneuvering. Now, that's to say that regardless of what control inputs you have, you shouldn't do anything that can cause you to hit the water in fewer than 30 seconds. Now, this works fine for 300 or even 100 feet above the surface in a vehicle where all you have to do is pull up and you can get enough physical clearance from the surface to troubleshoot any issues or even just take a break. However, Ekranoplans don't have that option. Sure, they can just settle back into the water. However, that may not be an option at 250 knots. A mistake such as dipping a wing into the water too much could be catastrophic. Remember, they rely entirely on ground effect in order to remain above the surface. Additionally, operating at those low levels isn't without other hazards, such as birds getting sucked into the engine or hitting a fragile part of the fuselage/hull, or the possibility of encountering FOD or high crosswinds. At that altitude and those speeds, the human brain is working in overdrive to keep up with everything that is going on. Additionally, even with electronic aids to help, the physical effort of moving the control surfaces constantly over the water is such a physical workout that it works up not just a sweat, but it can push a body to its limits as well. Therefore, it's not surprising that Ekranoplan crews reported high levels of exhaustion after missions. The crew fatigue issue isn't to be lightly dismissed. Ekranoplans had a potential range of over 1,000 miles, and at 300 knots, that's several hours of hard work for 1 or 2 people. Combining that with combat and introducing a major human factors issue. Let's return for a second to the issue of bird strikes. Now, that isn't a non-issue, since several large species of bird can be seen even several miles off the shore. Them, plus the possibility of foreign object damage, only compounds the closer the Ekranoplan operates to the shore. And as if that wasn't enough, salt water and metal don't mix very well, and this particular vehicle is ingesting salt water into its engines for the entirety of its operating life. Now, this increases maintenance costs at the risk of major issue if not properly dealt with. As mentioned before, the Loon class in particular can only achieve 16 feet off the ground. Generally, aircraft turn using a combination of roll and yaw with some pitch control to maintain altitude. While Ekranoplans have a lot of rudder, I wasn't able to get an effective change in direction out of my model, and so I still needed to add some aileron to the main wings to facilitate a turn. And even then, I couldn't get much more than 10 degrees angle of bank at best, and more like 5 on average when I was able to keep it to the correct height above the ground. While turn radius isn't really possible to calculate in Flyout, I figured it's probably thousands of feet at a minimum, potentially miles, to execute a full 180-degree turn. So the issue of a turn radius presents a major navigation problem. To properly fly this vehicle, you need to anticipate landmasses and obstacles such as other vessels along your route and make adjustments early. This further adds to and even compounds the crew fatigue issue I mentioned earlier. Second, you need to be able to spot these hazards early enough to be of any use. Soviet Ekranoplans in the Caspian Sea had pre-positioned spotters along its route in order to make sure that the route was clear. Now, this isn't practical if the vehicle is going to be used in a wartime setting. So that creates effectively two options for navigation. Either the Ekranoplan has to travel with a spotter aircraft, which would lead to detection by an adversary force, or it has a powerful navigation radar, which could be sensed by an adversary force as well, which is why I gave my counter aircraft, the EA-113, a strong EW suite. And all of this is assuming a calm sea state, as the vehicle would need to have a fairly flat surface for the ground effect to work effectively. A high sea state would have made it impossible to operate this vehicle. Part 4. Notional employment. So given all of these limitations, but also considering its advantages, if this vehicle was to be employed, I think it would need to have played to its strengths. So I'm going to focus on the carrier killer aspect of the vehicle. Now, while I think the amphibious delivery mission is probably the best use case, I don't see it being practical for a Soviet amphibious landing unless the carrier issue had been dealt with first. So for today's scenario, let's make some assumptions. First, that the Warsaw Pact and NATO have engaged in a conventional shootout somewhere in Germany that is at the point of a stalemate. Nuclear weapons so far have not been employed. Now, as a side note, given the current, as of 2025, state of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, I think this was a much more likely scenario than perhaps we have realized in the past. Let's also say that NATO, and the US specifically, have placed at least one carrier in the North Sea to support its defensive operations in Germany. The Soviet Baltic fleet is holed up and unable to pass through the Denmark Straits, and therefore unable to break the stalemate on the continent. And so the Soviets and Warsaw Pact countries decide to employ the Lung class to bust out and attack the American carriers. So on the surface, the mission is simple. Break through the Denmark Straits, locate and destroy U.S. carriers in the North Sea. The surface ships of the Baltic fleet will follow and try to hold the straits to allow the Soviets access into the North Sea. And for today, let's also assume a good sea state. To operate, the Lung class will need to push way far out ahead of their friendly forces, essentially meaning that they have to operate alone and unafraid. Air support is probably not available for this strike, and even if it was, using air assets for cover or even navigation would alert NATO to their presence. So the need to be autonomous is clearly called for. That means that they will need to be banging away with their navigation radar in order to be able to know where they're going. This also could give them away, but only if NATO is scanning for the signals. But that means that there could still be an air threat if they're detected and located. That could be difficult if they're going 300 knots over the water, but it's certainly not impossible. The strike force will need some kind of anti-aircraft capability in addition to its anti-ship missiles. Further, because of the radars, it's easy to give away your position, so you may want to hide your forces in a different way. For this, I would employ the Lun as a 4 or 5 ship section operating together. The lead ship will be a pathfinder, banging away with its radar to navigate for the others. 2 ships will carry anti-aircraft missiles and be searching the air for aircraft threats. 1 or 2 other loons would follow with the anti-ship missiles. All its radars turned off in order to be able to hide. Therefore, the formation would look like this. The 2 anti-aircraft ships would flank the lead in a modified fighting wing formation, up to 45 degrees off the lead's beam. between 1 to 2 miles off the center line. The anti-ship vehicles would be 1 to 2 miles in trail of those vehicles, able to maneuver plus or minus 45 degrees off the center line. This would create a V or a pentagram formation, but when traversing the straits, they could bring their formation in more closely. Once into the North Sea, the lead vehicle will both navigate and search for the targets. Once acquired, the lead would give bearing, range, and distance to the two anti-ship strikers, who would then power on their targeting radars. Once powered, and upon target acquisition, a simultaneous launch of the missiles would occur against the threat. At this point, the Luns would be able to turn around and try to head back to the Baltic Sea and to the safety of their own lines. Given the turn radius, they may not be able to turn quickly enough to bravely run away. So either they maintain their speed and risk running into a NATO naval forces during their turn, or they stop and attempt a 180 in the seas, making them vulnerable to NATO's traditional anti-ship weapons. I'm not sure which one would save the most time, but either option seems pretty bad, so this may be a suicide run. Conclusions. Given the limitations of the technology, I think the Soviets made the right decision to focus more on conventional seafaring technology. While their Ekranoplans were supposedly cheaper to manufacture than a cruiser, their limitations based on sea state, turn radius, and crew fatigue make it a vehicle that only really fills a niche that can be filled with other types of more traditional vehicles. Why not, for instance, just equip your Tu-22M blinders with the Soviet equivalent of the Harpooner Exocet and have them fly low level over the water? Sure, the size advantage of an Ekranoplan is nice, but the blinder has the ability to do other things as well. I don't want to be too harsh, though. These are the only instances of this technology being used as a weapon of war. It would be as if we decided that the airplane or the tank was no good based on the few instances during the First World War that they were used. Iteration is what makes technologies work, and employing them constantly is what forces the refinement of not just the tactics, techniques, and procedures, but also the technologies and tools that make the system work better. It's entirely possible that through evolution, our Ekanoplans could have overcome these limitations and become a viable weapons delivery system. We forget that the airplane and the tank have over a century of use and refinement. The Ekranoplan has had far less than half of that time of serious study and employment. I can't wait to see your comments on this. If you like this long-form deep dive content, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe as well. Thank you for coming with me on this journey into what could have been. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.